Long before the metaverse, VR headsets, Kinect, or even the Wii, there was the PlayStation EyeToy. To gamers today, this looks like primitive tech. It's just a PlayStation branded webcam. But back in late 2003, it was a pretty incredible advancement on the part of PlayStation. While yes, it was just a webcam, it allowed players to do a range of things on the PlayStation 2. You could scan your face into a number of different sports games for your created character, to varying degrees of success. It also allowed for motion control gaming long before the Wii became a cultural phenomenon and the Kinect divided Xbox gamers. I'm not sure whether PlayStation saw EyeToy as a big success for the company, selling around 10 million units. However, they did release a follow-up camera called the PlayStation Eye, so they clearly had some belief in it. Even the PlayStation camera, which plays a big role in PlayStation VR's movement tracking, is basically a successor to that little webcam from 2003. But you're probably wondering why I'm talking about this PlayStation peripheral. Well, that's because Nicktoons Movin was just one of about 25 or so games to be designed exclusively for the EyeToy. If you exclude games developed by PlayStation themselves, it's just one of 9 EyeToy titles to ever be made. Nicktoons Movin is the strangest and most unique Nickelodeon game in history. My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Pretty much released on the 1-year anniversary of the EyeToy's debut on store shelves, Nicktoons Movin is such a fascinating game. Like I already said, the fact that it's a motion-controlled EyeToy game is unique in and of itself. Combine that with only 25 EyeToy games ever being made, only 9 of which were from third-party publishers, and yeah, Nicktoons Movin is special. On top of that, only 8 of those games ever released in North America, 2 of which were third-party titles, Nicktoons Movin and Sega Superstars. Outside of the US, you had such memorable classics like Disney Move and Cardcaptor Sakura, Sakura-chan to Asobo. The development team in charge of this weird Nickelodeon video game odyssey was Mass Media Games. Based in California, they were purchased by THQ in 2007, but were almost immediately shut down. In defiance of this baffling decision that makes THQ's demise make ever more sense, Mass Media immediately reopened and repurposed their studio to work on various aspects of the PlayStation 3 social hub, PlayStation Home. They clearly had an interest in working on innovative and quirky ideas in the video game space. But let's pump the brakes and go back in time for a second. Mass Media's work history prior to Nicktoons Movin is spectacularly unremarkable. The one game that did catch my eye was Shrek Super Party, a Mario Party clone that I played the hell out of as a kid. This led me down a wormhole where I discovered that they developed a couple of other Mario Party clones, one based on Pac-Man and the other based on the Muppets. Knowing this, it seems like they would have been a much better fit for Nickelodeon Party Blast. I've only played Shrek Super Party, but that game is light years better than the garbage served up by Data Design Interactive. After experimenting with PlayStation Home, Mass Media carved out their little niche as a support studio, helping out with Saints Row 2 and Darksiders, working on the Jak and Daxter and Ratchet & Clank HD ports, and providing support on Evolve and Mafia 3. And hey, they're still around to this very day, so good for them. Reviews were mixed here though, with the average score settling just under a 6 out of 10. I wasn't exactly expecting a motion control game based on Nickelodeon to endear itself to critics though. Despite only 10 million units selling and around 24 games ever being made specifically for it, EyeToy is a strangely nostalgic thing for people who grew up around the same time as me. So let's do some warm-up stretches, make sure those arms are loose, and get ready to quite literally jump into Nicktoons Movin.
Tiny bubbles!
Outside of the obvious quirk of being an EyeToy game, Nicktoons Movin's other biggest selling point is the fact that it's a Nicktoons crossover. But for those of you who never owned an EyeToy or didn't even have a PS2 at all, you really didn't miss out on much. Movin only features 5 different Nicktoons: SpongeBob, Fairly Odd Parents, Danny Phantom, Jimmy Neutron, and Rocket Power. It's pretty poor, but I can kinda excuse it because the entire project is obviously one big experiment. A gigantic roster of shows was probably unrealistic. Where it really falls apart is how much love is given to each show. In total, there are 13 minigames here, with each being themed to a show. Rather than divide these up evenly, we have a pretty wonky distribution. SpongeBob gets 4, naturally, Fairly Odd Parents gets 3, and the other shows only get 2 games as their entire representation. The SpongeBob love spreads further than just the games, as SpongeBob and Patrick are basically your hosts here, spouting lines in the menus and introducing the various games, sort of like CatDog in Party Blast. And yes, in a move that is sure to frustrate the 50 All-Star Brawl players left, Movin has voice acting. I'm 99% sure they got original voice lines here too, at least for SpongeBob and Patrick, because they are constantly yelling stuff at you in the menus. Seriously, please leave me alone for like 5 goddamn seconds.
You're the top of the top's top part thingy. Today's ocean forecast, wet! It doesn't get any better than this. Bikini Bottom rules!
The other shows have their characters saying various lines during their respective minigames, but from what I heard, they definitely could have been ripped from episodes.
Treat them like the metal monsters they are!
As you've figured out by now, this being an EyeToy game means my actual face is plastered all over the gameplay here. Unlike the Kinect, which mostly did away with this for a lot of its games, literally every EyeToy game I have ever seen plasters the webcam footage onto the screen. I'm sure there has to have been a reason for it, likely the limitations of the technology at the time, because I genuinely don't think any EyeToy games strayed from doing this. Like the crossover aspects, Movin is similarly light on content. I will give it a bit of credit. All 3 of the EyeToy Play games from Sony had just 12 unique minigames, so this has them beat by 1 with the added benefit of being attached to a beloved IP. You've got a single player option where you just play through the games one at a time and chase high scores, as well as a multiplayer option. I didn't play this, but from the looks of the setup screen, it seems to play out in more of a Mario Party or Mario Kart style format. I think this would have been where the real fun was back in 2004. I could see this being a riot at sleepovers like the Wii was, especially because some of these games could handle up to 8 players at a time. But yeah, the single player is pretty bare bones, it's literally just the games. You don't get a story or characters from different shows interacting, with each minigame being confined to the world of the show it's based on. They could have at least tried to give some sort of competitive aspect with the AI and modelled it around the multiplayer. Chasing after a random high score doesn't have much pull in comparison. When you do manage to nab the high score, you get to take a fire-ass photo to throw on your Instagram. Me and the Nicktoons out here like we're about to drop the hottest mixtape of 2022.
Make money, money, make money, money, money. Money makes the world go round.
When you select a minigame to play, you get a short clip from the show it's based on, with the clip always tying into the game at least tangentially. This means pretty much all of the minigames here are inspired by episodes, which is a very nice touch. I'm sure the desire to phone this in and put out some generic minigames is pretty strong for a developer working on a game like this, so I appreciate mass media going through this extra effort. Before I jump into the minigames and talk about them individually, we've got to talk about the overall implementation of the motion controls. Probably the biggest issue with Nicktoons Movin, and probably just EyeToy games in general, is the limitations of the camera. Even back in the day as a kid playing EyeToy Play, I'd get annoyed by my inputs and gestures not registering correctly. It's pretty jarring to experience when you come over from a typical controller or keyboard and mouse experience where everything just works. Some games work flawlessly in Movin, but then other times the controls can be janky or so fidgety that you really don't want to play anymore. What's the point of picking a minigame if what you're actually doing plays such a minor part in whether the characters are going to be successful in their game or not? In my brief experiences with Kinect games, I never really had this issue, so I think this mostly comes down to being a classic case of EyeToy being a victim of having a great idea too early. The technology just can't keep up with many of the ideas developers had to make fun games. What I was impressed by was just how physically intense these games can be. After booting it up and playing for an hour, I walked away being genuinely tired. It felt like I had worked out. If you allow me to humble brag for a little bit, I'm in pretty decent shape and try to steer clear of the typical gamer diet. I wasn't expecting a bunch of minigames where I flail my arms around to test me at all. But a number of games had me puffing by the end, and at the conclusion of each play session, my arms were sore. This was just from playing on the medium difficulty setting too. I'd hate to see what would happen on hard. I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised by this, because in 2007 the Mayo Clinic conducted a study using Nicktoons Movin that looked at the potential for movement-based games, like ones utilising EyeToy, to help fight childhood obesity. I'm petitioning for all gyms to add a Nicktoons Movin station to their setup from now on. This is the key to eradicating obesity. Okay, let's look at each minigame individually, starting with SpongeBob's section. The very first game presented to you is Bikini Bottom Bowling. Yeah, literally just bowling. It's basically Wii Bowling before Wii Bowling existed. Or more accurately, it's the so-called Wii Bowling you have at home when you ask your parents if we can have Wii Bowling. This one's really a victim of the EyeToy's limitations. You don't actually get to bowl here. The only thing you control is the direction of the ball. The game auto bowls it for you and puts it into a random direction, then it's up to you to swipe at some arrows to try and get it into a position for a strike. I will admit I did enjoy playing this one, but it's so laughably basic. It'll hardly keep you coming back for more the way Wii Bowling had a stranglehold on society in 2007. The next SpongeBob minigame is Krabby Patty Match. Here, different Krabby Patty ingredients will get tossed in the air and you have to tap on the identical ingredients. This one is actually pretty hard because it is insanely easy to tap on the wrong ingredient and mess everything up. I started out trying to play this genuinely, using my peripheral vision to keep track of ingredients and precisely tap on the correct ones. But I was having very little success with that, so I resorted to the elite strategy of flailing my arms around like an insane person, which worked so much better. I think this is how you're actually supposed to play it, because the EyeToy is definitely not capable of the precision required to play this minigame normally. At least doing this gets the blood pumping. Flailing around had me sweating more than an actual workout. This minigame also introduces the structure that's seen in the majority of games throughout Nicktoons Movin. The game will give you an objective, e.g. match X amount of ingredients in a time limit. When you complete it, you move on to the next stage where the amount required increases, but the time limit feels so arbitrary. At first, I thought you had an overall time limit for the game, so if you complete the first stage really slow, you'll have almost no time left in the second stage. However, that's not quite accurate. It's tied to, in some fashion, to how well you do, because when I'd absolutely dominate a stage, I'd get more time in the following one, but the time limits still seemed completely arbitrary. Then we've got Boating Madness, essentially the exact same game as bowling, but you're in a boat. You're driving along an on-rail section and have to swipe left or right to pick things up and avoid obstacles. Also, try to avoid killing SpongeBob in a head-on collision. I guess there is a good reason why SpongeBob never got his boating license. This game is pretty dull overall. Not even the thrill of murdering a lot of innocent pedestrians can hold your interest for much longer than a playthrough or two. Jellyfish Jam is the final of the SpongeBob themed games and was actually the game used in the 2007 Mayo Clinic study. This plays out sort of like whack-a-mole. Jellyfish will pop up and you have to slap them. Yes, slap them. The game literally refers to what you're doing as slapping. So you're just going along, bopping the jellyfish.
He'll bop me.
All the while trying to avoid hitting Squidward or Mr. Krabs. This incurs a minor penalty in the first stages, but the final stage sees the game's controls being mirrored if you mess up. This ends up breaking your brain as left becomes right and vice versa. Trying to rewire my brain on the fly was a hell of an experience, and I found I struggled way more to adapt to this than in games using traditional controllers that do a similar thing. Overall, this game is a bit of fun, and I'd probably place it at the top of all of the SpongeBob minigames. Hell, this is probably the best minigame in all of Nicktoons Movin. So we move on to Fairly Odd Parents, and the first game based on that show is a big swing and a miss. It's called Magical Mix-Up, and it's literally just an unscramble this image puzzle. Simple stuff, right? Well, no matter what I did, I could not get any sort of control to work in this game. The instructions told me to rub the boxes, which gross, but no amount of rubbing would prompt the game to do anything. Maybe my rubbing technique just needs a bit of work. Regardless, this is just a very simple game, and I can't imagine it would have brought me too much enjoyment, even if it worked flawlessly. Fishbowl Frenzy is also a big fan of getting the player to rub the air vigorously. In this one, cracks are starting to form inside Cosmo and Wanda's fishbowl, and rubbing them magically returns them to normal. Seems simple on the surface, but the game throws heaps of cracks at you at once, forcing you to madly flail around and try to prioritize which cracks are getting the biggest. Cracks get too big, it's game over. I just don't get the vibe that rubbing works too well with EyeToy, or maybe this is on mass media itself. Rubbing the screen feels so imprecise here, and for all of the games that required similar gestures, and when the gestures aren't working right, these EyeToy games become downright miserable. Fairly Odd Invasion steps away from vigorous rubbing and instead provides the player with a bit of action. With Timmy placed inside a giant hamster ball, you need to direct him around as you crush robots into 1,000 pieces. It's surprisingly satisfying to do this, and while directing Timmy around isn't completely fluid, destroying the robots more than makes up for it. There are actually a number of power-ups Timmy can pick up here, but in my personal experience, it felt like they were too hard to really take advantage of. While I'm in the middle of flailing my arms around to get to the next robot, it's a bit hard to really focus on what power-ups are on the screen. It's a little too chaotic when my literal body is being used as the game's controller. Next up, we have Danny Phantom's 2 minigames, which are 2 of the worst games in all of Nicktoons Movin. Ghost Catcher is naturally all about catching ghosts. Sam and Tucker are being chased by ghosts, and it's up to Danny to catch them in the Fenton Thermos. You need to try and zap up the ghosts without hitting your friends, because hitting them will push you back in your quest to collect however many ghosts the stage asks for. Unfortunately, the controls for this are so clunky. Getting Danny to pop up and shoot at a ghost is remarkably unreliable. Half the time it felt like the game was just deciding to do its own thing. When you couple the poor controls with the fact that this is one of the only games here that requires precision, well, you're in for a bad time. The only other Danny Phantom game, Portal Party, isn't much better either. It's quite similar to Fairly Odd Invasion, as Danny is moving around an arena trying to defeat ghosts. The way you control your character is different here. You have to touch the outside of the arena, and whatever direction you touch is where Danny will head. And instead of simply rolling over the enemies, defeating them requires Danny to go full Beyblade. Danny is useless in his standard form, but when you pick up these power-ups, he'll start spinning around like Dragoon. The weird touch the outside to direct Danny control scheme is completely unintuitive and makes Danny become the least nimble superhero ever. He's got the turning circle of a Mack truck here. This makes just picking up the power-ups a huge challenge. If you do make it to the later stages, multiple ghosts will come after you and gangbang you in the corner, essentially trapping you. You can always get out, technically, but because the movement controls are such hot garbage, it might as well be impossible. The Jimmy Neutron levels make a much better first impression with the dull but not awful Deep Sea Danger. This is an on-rails side-scrolling segment where you need to pick up power cells while dodging mines. To control the submarine, you touch the arrows on the far right of the screen. If you want to go up, you touch the higher arrows, and if you want to go down, you touch the lower arrows. It functions well enough, but there's nothing of interest here. Dodging the mines is incredibly easy, and there's nothing else going on in the minigame outside of that. Luckily, Deflecto-Matic is a bunch of fun. Here we have a ball bouncing around. On the outside are a bunch of deflector shields, but they're only activated when you touch them and only stay on for a few seconds before switching off again. It's your job to try and string together a streak of deflections, which devolves into absolute chaos that really tests your reaction time. This is the kind of stuff I wanted to see more of. EyeToy melds the real life and virtual worlds, so why not test out some more real world abilities like reaction time? It also gets some bonus points just because it reminds me so much of the barrier ball minigame from Pokemon Stadium 2. Lastly, we have Rocket Power, probably the most out of place show in this game, as it's the only one that had finished airing at the time of Movin's release date. The first game, known as Hanging Out, might just be the worst minigame on display here. It starts out as a simple navigate through these rings game where you're hang gliding above ocean shores. The only issue is that the controls are so convoluted that I couldn't get my character to get anywhere near the rings half the time. I gave it multiple shots, and every time I felt like I might have finally cracked the code, I'd inevitably go careening off to the side. By the end of it all, I was ready to karate kick my webcam. And the very final minigame in Nicktoons Movin is Rocket Hockey. It's just you playing as a hockey goalie. This is such a natural fit here, but I can't say it was interesting even in the slightest. Your hands take up such a big portion of the goals that I found it so easy to deflect shots. I think a better idea would have been to get the player to take shots at goal, mimicking a hockey swing, rather than having me block all of Reggie and Otto's shots with my eyes closed. In a stunningly short amount of time, I'd breezed through all of Nicktoons Movin's minigames, and could only say I truly enjoyed 2 or 3 of them. A minigame collection is never going to be the most interesting game in the world, but I think with the unique nature of being EyeToy exclusive, mass media could have played around with some much more innovative ideas. A number of the games here, like the Unscrambled a Picture game, don't do enough to take advantage of the fact that my body is literally the controller. It might be a combo of both the limitations of the hardware at the time as well as the developer in charge here, but regardless, it leaves Nicktoons Movin being an unremarkable experience. There are some genuinely fun minigames here, but even those fun minigames are something you'd play once and then never return to. Even with the multiplayer aspect thrown in, I can't see how Nicktoons Movin would have much of a lifespan. A lot of the games don't even seem like a great fit for multiplayer. But having said that, I'd still recommend checking this game out. Usually I'd tell you to stay clear of a game I've been this negative on, but Nicktoons Movin is so unique and can be experienced in such a short time that it's definitely worth it. It's one of the only EyeToy games ever made, and one of the handful of third-party EyeToy games too. It's a neat little curiosity in Nick's video game history, and a fun look back at how far these types of games have come over the past 20 years. Also, the minigames are arguably better than the ones in Party Blast, so there's that too. Next time I'll be checking out the SpongeBob movie game on home consoles and GBA. Battle for Bikini Bottom tends to get all of the praise and accolades when the general video game community talks about SpongeBob or Nickelodeon games. And while it deserves that praise, it surprises me that the SpongeBob movie game gets talked about significantly less, when it actually received slightly higher reviews than its predecessor. I can't wait to take a look at it and see whether it's an underappreciated gem of Nickelodeon video game history. To make sure you don't miss that review, hit the subscribe button, and follow me on Twitter to stay up to date on what's happening with the channel.